Welcome to the Warley Motor Railway Club virtual event featuring club life, the exhibition and the exhibitors. We hope you enjoy this presentation.
I am talking today to Kevin Robertson, co-author of the new edition of Blue Pullman, published by Crecy and recently released. So Kevin, why Blue Pullman?
Well, I've always had a fascination for the unusual. To me, railways aren't just things that go up and down every day, it's different things that happen as well. And Blue Pullman is one of those things I knew very little about, and it turns out neither did many others. And really, it all started as a result of a show some years ago when I was looking around various stalls and I saw probably no more than 3 or 4 photographs of the interior of the train. I didn't know, as I say, much about it. I don't think others did either. So a little bit more digging around, and well, the result was lots of information was there, just sat on the surface. And that resulted in the first book from Kestrel. That was a hardback in 2005 that subsequently went to reprint. And then 2 paperbacks followed as a result. But let me stress straight away, this new book is not an amalgam of the three just glued together. It's totally different, rewritten from start to finish, and a lot more pages.
I see for this new edition you have a co-author, Mike Smith. How did this come about?
Well, the factual information was easy to find, as I say, since 2005, and then since the paperbacks, a lot more factual information and photographs have come to light. It didn't seem appropriate to do just a third paperback supplement of images, so hence the decision to rewrite everything from start to finish. And I was part way through that, and in correspondence with Terry By, who does a monthly, or slightly more than that, internet thing on Pullman, and it's very good as well. And Terry suggested I speak to Mike Smith, who is very good on the social media side and finding information. Social media is not something I'm particularly involved in. So it made sense to talk to Mike, and Mike turned up with an awful lot. So, well, let's invite him in, let him be a co-author. And I'm glad I did as well, because he's added an awful lot to it. The problem, though, is at some stage we had to stop. And whilst it's great actually finding new information, you've got to think of practicalities when it comes to books as well. We were a year late in delivery, and so if anybody was waiting for that, we both do apologise. But the publisher also said there had to be a stop at some stage, and so nearly 400 pages and whatever in a reprint, we end up with a new book.
Tell me a bit about Blue Pullman itself.
Well, Blue Pullman was conceived as a result of the 1955 modernisation plan for British Railways. BR needed to change their image. They needed to do something different to attract passenger numbers which were hemorrhaging badly to the private motor car and business traffic to the airlines. And Blue Pullman was a luxury train. It was conceived as a result of trips to Europe, taking the very best of Europe, taking the very best of what British Railways and manufacturers could produce as well. BR didn't think they could build it themselves. They didn't have the capacity. And so, like the modernisation plan with diesels, they ended up subcontracting the whole thing to Metropolitan Camel in Birmingham, and they produced 5 trains to BR's specification. 2 were for the London Midland region, 3 for the Western region. But the idea that they would be ready within 2 years, well, it was a bit optimistic, and dates were put back and back and back. And in the end, it wasn't until the summer of 1960, 5 years after the idea had first been mooted, that the trains actually entered service.
Did the trains run everywhere?
No, just on 2 regions, the London Midland and then the Western. And the London Midland service was a business service from Manchester to St Pancras in the morning and St Pancras to Manchester in the evening. 1 train doing that. The other problem was it needed to do something during the day. So they adopted a fill-in service, initially from St Pancras to Leicester, and then later extending that to Nottingham. But again, we have a problem here because there were 2 trains on the London Midland, and these were actually mirror sets, if you know what that means. And what it actually means in practice is you had power car, parlour car, and kitchen car, and then the reverse for the other 3. So it's 2 half sets joined together, 2 restaurant cars, in actual fact, 2 kitchen cars in a 6-coach train. And the other 6-coach train just sat there doing nothing all day long. So it was a little bit of a wasted resource, 50% wasted resource. But the idea again was to try and ensure that the service could be maintained all the time. Although where do you put that spare train? Midway, I suppose, would be logical, but in actual fact the spare was kept at Manchester. So if there was a failure during the day, the difficulty could be getting it back to St Pancras ready for the return run.
I understand there were staffing issues as well.
Oh yeah, this is actually quite hilarious. We found out a lot more about it as well. The Pullman company was actually a private company, and whilst British Railways were of course a nationalised organisation, what the unions didn't want is an extension of private capacity. So although they were quite happy to allow the existing Pullman trains to run, as had been running at the time of nationalisation, they were dead against any expansion of the service. And this expansion of the service meant they couldn't attract staff. There were threats of industrial action affecting the whole of British Railways and so on. And we end up with a ludicrous situation that the Pullman staff had in effect a ongoing dispute. So certainly between St Pancras and, as was extended to Nottingham, as we mentioned just now, all the catering staff would down plates or down knives and forks and silver service when they got as far as Leicester, and they'd lock themselves away in the kitchen and do nothing. They were on strike until they got to Nottingham, and they were similarly on strike from Nottingham back to Leicester, whereupon they just donned their plates and overalls and things again and started serving in the same way.
Are you saying then that they were a failure?
No, the trains weren't a failure at the time. They showed the way forward. There were difficulties with them, I think would be the best way of describing it, and it doesn't matter whether we're talking about the London Midland or the Western region where there were 3 trains. There were problems with the running, there were problems with reliability, and I think the thing people think about more than anything else, there were problems with the ride. Even on the western region, where the track is referred to as Brunel's billiard table because it's so smooth, so good compared with some, there was instructions literally within the first few days that coffee cups were not to be filled more than half full, and a paper doily also put between the cup and the saucer to stop the rattling and everything else. There were complaints in the Times and the various other newspapers from the type of businessmen who travelled, and the headlines in the newspapers are with a splash, indicating don't have soup and don't drink coffee when you're going over certain junctions.
Was it wrong to concentrate them all on the western region?
Well, what the problem was, we have to go back historically to 1960. As I say, the trains were, 5.5 years in the making, which isn't a totally long time when you think about it, for a completely new innovation. But the long-term aim of British Railways was to electrify, and electrification of the London Midlands started between Manchester and Crewe in April 1960, and everybody knew eventually it would be extended to Euston. And in the interim, of course, the Blue Pullman trains on the Midland were running between St Pancras and Manchester. Now, when the full electrification to Euston came in, the problem was they didn't want a competing service via Derby to Manchester from St Pancras. So the Midland said, we don't want the trains anymore. What do you do with them? Well, who's going to take them? They were only 4 or 5 years old. It's far too new to scrap them. They looked around. The eastern region, the northeastern, almost took them, but they weren't happy about the running or the speed they could get to, and that was slower than the existing trains on the eastern region. You have to remember, if you go back, the Deltics, which were the mainstay out of King's Cross, were doing 105 miles an hour. Blue Pullman's maximum was 90. I don't think you'd want to go much faster in the thing because of the ride. So if the Eastern don't want them, the Northeastern wouldn't take them, what do you do? There's nothing on the Scottish, certainly. Southern, well, no, they had electrification. They were planning to go to Bournemouth as well. The Bournemouth Bell would be a casualty, of course, of the electrification 60 years ago. But then again, can you imagine a Blue Pullman going through Woking, going through Basingstoke, smashing things everywhere? A modern day replacement to the Bournemouth Bell? Possibly. But the Southern, say, didn't want it, so the Western had to have all 5. And to make it even worse, the Western's most profitable route had been Paddington to Birmingham by Blue Pullman. And that was no longer possible because all Birmingham trains were now being concentrated from Euston on the newly electrified line. So you've lost one of the routes out of Paddington, and you've now got 2 extra trains on top of that. So what do you do with them? They didn't have a clue, really. They couldn't run to Plymouth. There were problems with the power on the banks. They couldn't double up all the time. They tried fill-in turns to Oxford. None of it really worked. At that time, they were really becoming a little bit of a white elephant. Or perhaps we should say a blue elephant.
A lot of people tend to think Blue Pullman was the forerunner for the later day HST trains. Was that the case?
Depends on one's viewpoint, totally. Blue Pullman was a luxury train, aimed at the businessman, aimed at the business traveller. The 2 sets on the London Midland were first class only. You paid the first class fare, you paid a premium for travelling on Pullman, and you paid for meals on top. Agreed, they were served at your seat. What a lovely thought as well. And as they say, most passengers would pay the extra for a meal because BR's marketing was very, very clever. Because as they said themselves, it takes a very, very strong-willed person to ignore the smell of food, breakfast, dinner, whatever it might be, whilst everybody else is eating and you're not. But it was a train that was out of reach to the masses. Now, if we move forward a little bit, by the late 1960s, we've got air-conditioned stock as standard. Blue Pullman had been the first regular service to do this. And existing rolling stock was running at higher speeds behind locomotives. So why, therefore, should the passenger want or have to pay an extra premium to travel by this luxury train? At the end of the day, they wanted to get there fast, not necessarily with a meal at seat. So when we say, was it a forerunner? Well, having a power car at each end and a train that went from A to B and didn't need servicing and turning round at the other end, Yes, then it was the forerunner to the HST. But the HST was a train for the masses. Blue Pullman was a train for the minority.
And why were they withdrawn?
Well, because they didn't fit in. And as we said just now, if you take the Western region where they were all concentrated, you could leave Bristol in the morning and buy Blue Pullman, pay a supplement, and yet 10 minutes later you could also leave Bristol by an ordinary train without paying a supplement and arrive in Paddington faster. So there was no space for them, there was no room for them. And it's a great, great shame that British Railways at the time didn't think about the excursion market, the leisure market. I'm not saying they could be converted to sleeping cars, no. But nowadays, if you had one running still, my goodness, it would be a lovely thing to sort of travel around the country with meals at seat.
I understand there was a chance of sale to another country.
Indeed there was, and certainly even on the press days back in 1960, the London Midland service started in July, the Western service in September. And Metropolitan Camel, the builders, invited representatives from different countries, both Commonwealth and whatever, to try and get extra orders for these trains. They didn't succeed. But there was interest, and there was interest from places as far afield as Yugoslavia and then Chile. In fact, British Railways seem to have shot themselves in the foot, perhaps not for the first time, but that was when later on towards the end they said yes, we will sell them to Yugoslavia, but they wanted something like £1.6 million, and yet they sold them for scrap only a few months later for 100,000.
Is anything left?
Very, very little. All 5 trains, that's 3 8-car trains from the Western, 2 6-car trains from the Midland. They all went to scrap in South Wales. There was hope that one might have been saved, but in the end it wasn't, which is a great, great pity. So all that is left that we know of are a few seats, a couple of bits and pieces of equipment, a few labels. The trains were never named, so there were, apart from the unofficial name Blue Pullman. So there's no sort of nameplates or anything like that. A few artefacts and obviously photographs, paperwork and posters and so on. Indeed, one of the closed tunnels at Euston, following various rebuildings, there's even a poster of Blue Pullman left on the tube station wall. But apart from that, nothing else.
Did you ever travel on one of the trains?
No, I didn't. In fact, I have to admit, I never even saw it. I was certainly around looking at trains on the Western region in the early 1960s and the mid-60s, but I never saw one, which is a great pity. They changed the livery as well. Blue Pullman because of the blue livery, and it looked smart, it looked different, it looked very nice indeed. Later on they changed the livery around and it became white and silver. The change to the Pullman colours of the 1960s, and it didn't, late 1960s, and it didn't suit the trains at all, which is a great shame.
Oh dear. Well, thank you, Kevin. And if you're interested, the book, The Blue Pullman Story, fully revised and unabridged by Kevin Robertson and Mike Smith, consisting of a whopping 392 pages with much colour and certainly to me plenty of new images and information, is available from all good bookshops as well as outlets on the internet and of course direct from the publisher.
Hello, I'm Simon Lilly, and as part of this virtual Warley Model Railway show, I'll be talking about my new book, The Class 33's A 60-Year History.
Simon, why did you choose the Class 33s for your new book?
Well, as I was going through the various BR locomotive classes, I quickly realised that the Class 33s had not had much written about them over the last 30 years or so, the last book having come out in 1990. And so I thought, with 2020 being the 60th anniversary of the first ones entering service, this was an ideal opportunity to look in detail at their conception, their building, the work they've done, and how today some of them are still working on the main line and are active on heritage railways up and down the country.
So can you tell me a bit more about the Class 33s?
Well, initially, of the 98 locomotives built, 86 had the standard width bodies at 9'3", and the final 12 were given narrow bodies at 8 foot 8 inches wide for the Hastings line. In 1966, work started on converting 19 of the standard bodied locomotives, giving them push-pull equipment in readiness for the Bournemouth electrification scheme, where they work push-pull trains between Bournemouth and Weymouth.
So how does this book differ from what's been published before about the 33s?
Well, through detailed research at a number of archives, including the National Archives at Kew and National Royal Museum in York, much new information on the class has come to light, including matters like the late delivery claim that was made by the British Transport Commission against BRCW. I was also able to gain access to the preserved locomotive 33108, currently at the Severn Valley Railway at Kidderminster. This enabled a number of detailed shots of the exterior and interior to be taken, so illustrating the workings of the locomotive to an extent not seen previously. Also made available were a number of pictures of the locomotives under construction at BRCW's Smethwick works, again pictures that have never been published before. The book also takes the class through their entire life cycle, up to and including privatisation and preservation.
What was the most interesting thing that you found out after your research at Kew?
I think there's two things. Firstly, there's the question of the late delivery claim, which developed into quite an argument between the British Transport Commission on the one side and Crompton Parkinson, the electrical equipment manufacturers, on the other, over the acceptance criteria for the main generators. And secondly, when BR policy on names changed in 1977 to allow diesel locomotives to be named once again, the Southern region actually wanted to name all of its allocation of Class 33s.
So originally these locos were ordered for the Southern region. Did they do much work away from there?
They did actually. And quite early on in their lives, the Southern put them to work on cement trains from Cliff in Kent up to Uddingston, which they worked as far as York. That started in 1961. Shortly after that, they began work on the Warley to Bromford Bridge oil trains in the West Midlands. And in the 1980s, they were seen on the Crewe Cardiff services and some internal Western region services around Exeter.
So, were they generally successful locomotives?
Generally, yes, and they formed the backbone of the Southern region's locomotive fleet for many years. But they were not without their technical problems. And in 1967 a reliability modification package had to be put together in order to increase availability and their miles run between casualties. This work included modifications to the electrical system and the removal of the exhaust silencer, which was prone to cracking, so leading to locomotive failures on a regular basis.
What are your own memories of them?
My own memories are twofold. First of all, travelling into Waterloo a lot as a teenager, seeing them on the Waterloo to Exeter services, which they worked for over a decade. And secondly, because we took family holidays in Bournemouth, I would regularly see them on the Bournemouth to Weymouth push-pull service, where they would take 1 or 2 4TC units from Bournemouth to Weymouth and then propel those sets back to Bournemouth, ready for attaching to the 4-rep and onwards to London.
Simon, how many of these locomotives still remain today?
Well, there's 3 that see regular use with the Spot Hire Company West Coast Railway on charter work and empty stock movements, and then there's over another 20 that can be found at heritage railways across the country. So even today, 60 years on, the locomotives are still earning their keep, doing the job that they were built for originally.
So who is this book aimed at?
Well, it's aimed at a lot of different people, really. First of all, Class 33 enthusiasts. Secondly, people who are interested in what's known these days as classic modern traction. And railway modellers will get a lot out of the book as well, with the detailed photographs showing all the key variations and differences that occurred in the locomotives during their service life. So technical changes, liveries, names, it's all in there.
So Simon, what's your next book going to be about?
My next book is going to be about the Class 44, 45 and 46 peaks. I've chosen them because, again, like the Class 33s, there hadn't been a reference work on them before. And secondly, a number of people had contacted me and suggested that they would be a good subject to write about. So I have bowed to public demand.
Thanks for watching this presentation. We would like to thank our sponsors and the exhibitors for supporting this event. If you require further information or useful links, have a look at the video's description. Thank you for watching. We hope to see you when we are back at the NEC on the 27th and 28th of November 2021.